Hey everybody, welcome to TCP Talks with Jonathan Baker and Justin Broadley from the Cloud Pod. In this series, we're bringing you interviews with the best and brightest leaders and heroes from the tech and cloud industry.
Well, Jonathan, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself for our listeners to kick us off here today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. My name is Jonathan Heiliger. I'm a general partner at Vertex Ventures US. We started Vertex US about 6 years ago. We're an early stage venture capital firm that backs enterprising founders. We like to play on words there because we are B2B software investors. We are all former operators and founders ourselves and have backed about 50 companies to date, names like Perimeter X and LaunchDarkly, VGS, Very Good Security, Hasura, in all in the sort of dev and cloud space, and then spaces further afield like Hierarch in real estate and Desktop Metal and 3D metal printing as well. Prior to turning to the dark side of being an investor, I ran infrastructure at Facebook for about 5 years, which I guess gives me some credibility to be on this podcast. We scaled from about 30 million to just shy of 1 billion users while I was there, and actually started my career in infrastructure working at the dawn of the internet, literally converting the NSF net to become the internet in the early 90s. And went from that to becoming a founder myself, started my first company that fortunately was acquired, was actually acquired several times by bigger and bigger companies, but ultimately Global Crossing, where I did a lot of IP networking and different things there, was CTO, and at that point had fallen in love with being a behind the scenes engineer, and went from being an engineer to running engineering teams, and kind of switched my editor from VI to PowerPoint along the way, and ended up meeting one of my now partners at Vertex, Insik Ree, in 99, when Ben Horowitz and Mark Andreessen started LoudCloud that became Opsware. And I was the first non-founding employee at Opsware and ran product and engineering there. And kind of in between Opsware and Facebook, did other things at a little retail company called Walmart and a mobile device business that was the first smartphones that was a business called Danger that's now part of Microsoft, and hung out at Sequoia Capital for a few years, cleaning whiteboards, getting coffee, and helping entrepreneurs. So I've done kind of from scratch. I've scaled from scratch to hundreds of millions, and then I've done the sort of hundreds of millions to billions, and now we're back to the early stages and early bits of technology all over again.
That's quite the career. It's always fun to talk to people who are practitioners at one point and then moved into venture capital or into executive leadership. What called you to venture capitalism?
The cool blue suits. No, maybe not that exactly. But so I started my first company. I was 19. We were fortunate that one of the co-founders was an early Netscape employee, which just kind of pins us in a moment in time of when Netscape was still a small business. And we raised capital from Sequoia Capital, and a guy named Mike Moritz was our first investor. And at that point, our first customers were Yahoo, Netscape, and Playboy, actually. And so non-venture-backed business, importantly. But all these other businesses were venture-backed. And as we were growing and scaling and sort of all the fireball issues of building infrastructure and networks and hiring people and putting engineers to work and writing code, we were quickly inundated with other startups. We were a web hosting company, a web hosting business. And so we were quickly inundated with other startups that needed our help and services and guidance. And they're like, hey, how did you guys solve this problem? And how did you scale? And how did you overcome that? And so I was really interested in this notion of, well, how can I help? How can I help other people learn? That sort of led me down a path of advising companies and trying to be helpful, and generally invited in by the CTO or the CEO to spend a day a month with them or something like that, because I didn't have any capital to invest. And then from advising, well, you can't make more time, but you can make more money. And sort of along the way was fortunate to have some successful exits, and so made some money and started investing in companies, $25K at a time or $50K at a time, what we now think of as an angel investor, and being very commonplace. And ultimately that sort of led me back to venture, where there's a way of working with a small set of companies, and that's how we like to practice venture at Vertex, which is to be engaged investors and actually be helpful and know what's happening, not just in the company, but with the founders and their families and their ups and their downs, because these are tough businesses. And one of the things that made me successful all along the way through that sort of very twisted tale was I was very fortunate that kind of people took pity on me and became coaches and mentors and helpers along the way. And many of whom I still talk to, folks like Mike Moritz and others. And then so I wanted to be able to offer that same kind of support, whether it was just emotional support to yell at me in the middle of the night or real support of, oh shit, our firewall's down. Like, how do we fix it? It's like, there was a point in time when I could help someone do that. Not anymore, but thank goodness. But yeah.
Yeah, as I moved up, I had that same opinion. Like, I could fix it for you, but you really don't want me to, because my knowledge is about 10 years old, and it's probably changed.
One of my best memories from just like running operations was like literally it was a middle of the night phone call, and this thing that's not the actual thing, but a beeper went off. It was one of the early BlackBerries, and it's like network down, please call us, blah blah blah. This is and I don't know, 2-3 in the morning, sometime middle of the night. And they're literally like, yeah, the edge router went down. How do we fix it? And I was like, oh, you do this. Okay, it's back online. Great. I'm going back to bed. And like literally, and then like the next day I had no recollection of that. And it was like a few days later, someone, they reached out to me and they're like, yeah, thanks for saving our bacon the other night. We I forget what city it was in, but something like LA was down. It's like, oh, okay, cool. Like, just did that in the middle of the night, casual.
No big deal. The world of ops. Well, one of the things that intrigued us when we started talking about having you on the show was really around service ownership and the direction that service ownership kind of plays, which kind of feeds back to your operations conversation there. It's interesting because we've kind of gone through these paradigm shifts in the market. DevOps being a big one, then SRE is kind of now the new shift in operations and infrastructure. But this service ownership piece is actually an area I'm pretty passionate about. I know Jonathan's pretty passionate about as well. How do you feel about service ownership today in 2021? Compared to some of these other movements that have been really transformational, where do you think service ownership is sitting in that play? Is it still there? Is it still something people should be doing? Where does it kind of relate, as you see it, to infrastructure and kind of these other paradigm shifts that are happening?
Yeah, I'm happy to give you my thoughts. I'd love to hear what you guys think too. I mean, I think that service ownership is one of these, like, it's a big problem that's lurking just below the surface in every engineering team. I think even the most well-run engineering orgs, the majority of them use Excel spreadsheets to track who owns what service and even what services may talk to one another. Very few companies, I think, have yet to adopt microservices meshes and things like that, and using routers and abstractions between different layers of an application or between different microservices themselves. And so the notion that, like, of who even owns a service and how does someone discover that, I think is very broken inside of big companies, small companies, FANG companies, and laggard companies. And because the problem is, like, pretend you're a new engineer and when he or she joins, how do they figure out what components to use? Like, what's the right version of a particular service to use? How are they operated? Where's the documentation? Who do you go to ask questions? When is the time to deprecate it and maybe migrate to a new thing or a new version or something like that? I think often these are questions that kind of are the provenance of SRE teams or DevOps teams, or in larger organizations. Actually, we've seen that they're owned by, like, even a smaller subset, like the platform engineers or the senior SREs, because there's just way too much complexity to keep in one's mind. And I think that all of that it spawns from just the organic nature of how so many services are developed and built and then scaled. And then all of the third-party tools that we end up bringing in, right? It's like, hey, you have your monitoring thing. She has her monitoring thing. You have another logging system and a login analytics system. And there tends to be a lot of duplication in service architectures these days.
Who do you think should own the services? I mean, we have sort of product ownership, product management, leading development teams who often kind of build these artifacts and deployed by an entirely separate team, whether it be DevOps or SRE anymore. What do you think that should look like from a service ownership perspective?
I guess I can describe what I've seen or what I think of as a high performance team and best performing team. And I saw a lot of these problems firsthand at Facebook as we were scaling the infrastructure. We started with 30-ish engineers and grew to over 1,000 just on the infra team. And because of that, different teams were using multiple tools and many times competing tools. And I think in a lot of instances that competition is good because the cream rises to the top. You get to see how tool A or approach A works versus B and C and D. But how we ended up crafting our organization was we started with a centralized SRE team that were, in many cases, the outgrowth of a sysadmin organization. That org then split into two tiers: production engineering that focused on core infrastructure, things like service catalogs and logging and common infrastructure, and the SRE team that embedded themselves within each functional area. So, for example, we used to have, like an operations team that would operate the database tier and database services, and an engineering team that would build and code and deal with bugs on that same database engineering system. And instead, it was just a simple organizational change, but it had massive impact, which was to put those two teams together and make one manager responsible both for performance engineering, essentially all of the product features of databases as a service to every other internal customer in the business. So whether he, in this case, it was a guy, whatever he decided in terms of building features and trading off new feature development versus performance versus delinting and sort of removing engineering debt, he had full ball control because ultimately he was responsible for delivering this product, database as a service, to all of his internal customers. And over time, we extended that logic to product teams. So in order to get product teams to think about performance as a feature, first you have to define the metric, and then you want to make them responsible for it. So the photos team initially didn't have performance as a metric, and they would do different things and make photos and fun and interesting and bigger and smaller and with rounded corners and square corners and all things that impacted performance, because they didn't own the performance metric. They're like, oh, that's someone else's problem. They'll deal with it. And so the organizational change of bringing together dev and ops into truly into one team and making that decision at each kind of functional product had a tremendous impact to, in the case of Facebook, sort of going from move fast and breaking things to move fast with stable infra.
It's interesting. My experience of sort of service ownership is coming into an organization which is old, been around for a long time, 20 plus years, which has been sort of more traditionally run in terms of separate infrastructure and IT teams, separate dev teams, and a NOC and some engineers, and sort of coming in to do a cloud transformation 5 or so years ago. We are staffed very asymmetrically. There may be 1,200 engineers working on the core product of the company, and then 10 engineers working on internal services or platform services and things like that. So how do you if you want to offer database as a service or anything as a service, how do you sort of ensure that those things can scale?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jonathan. So I think I part of that is separating out what are the KPIs or key criteria of each of these services. And, first and foremost, I think defining service ownership is job number one, right? And defining that database is a service, and what are the SLAs and SLOs of that service? What availability guarantee, what performance guarantee, what are the objectives of that service? Just as you might have like in finance, like a settlement function that's part of an application, or in e-commerce, a shopping cart service, right? Like that shopping cart has a whole series of dependencies on other bits of code, both application code and infrastructure code. And it's very easy to focus on, is the shopping cart available or not? But like you just described, if you have 1,200 engineers working on applications and features and 10 working on infrastructure, that infrastructure team is going to be mighty overwhelmed. And I would argue then, for just kind of the scenario I just described that we went through at Facebook, this was circa 2010 when we brought these teams together, is instead of having separate teams, like a mobile team, a front-end team, a shopping cart team, and an infra team, is to bring them together. And that way you're really starting off from the point of view that each team has cradle to grave responsibility for the services that they can own. And then they can more cleanly define interfaces to their peer services, whether that's database, security, maybe a login, user database or something like that. If we're talking about an e-commerce application, we'll continue using that example. They can define clean interfaces between them and abstractions between them and describe in that interface what they expect from the other application in terms of response time and uptime and all those criteria. Because I think without that, it sort of turtles all the way down. It's, there's downtime, there's lost business, there's lost trust, there's distrust between internal organizations, there's fighting about, the shopping cart team is like, hey, this database service isn't being responsive to me. I'm going to build my own database. And then all of a sudden you have 16 different databases in use inside the company. And that means 16 times the expertise needed to make them work and scale and operate, and less likely that you're actually going to get knowledge sharing and knowledge transfer across those teams.
Do you think this is something that only large organizations can do? I mean, do you need some type of scale, in the hundreds or more of employees to implement this type of model, or do you think smaller organizations can also make this work?
Great question. So we actually, last year, my colleagues and I interviewed dozens of practitioners, sort of, gathering market feedback on this exact topic, both from, kind of small, mid-sized businesses, startups, businesses that were mid-sized, had been around for a while, up to, financial services giants, web monsters on the internet, those types of things. And of the dozens of companies we spoke to, the first observation was that only 2 hadn't yet started their journey from breaking down a monolithic application to microservices. And the second was that the number that kept coming up was once the company reaches about 30 developers, that's when decentralizing control and changing your organization structure really has kind of initial impact. So I don't think you need 200 developers or 500 developers or 10,000 developers. It makes an impact at 30. It might even make an impact a little lower than that, but that's where, from our interviews, that seemed to be the efficient frontier of making a big impact.
That's a surprisingly low number. I was expecting you to come back with a much larger number than that. I interview a lot of potential candidates for the company I'm currently working for, and so we get a lot of people from people who've been to Facebook, been to Google. They want to slow down the pace of their career maybe for a short while, and so I often get into conversations about SRE as a principle and the way the FAANG companies work. And it seems like at scale it will be perhaps much easier. For smaller companies, I think we sort of struggle with very small teams which don't share knowledge very well, and so those 3 people are very sort of very focused or very aware of the very small piece of the product they're working on. And I think SRE almost requires you to be a bit more broad with your experience and to move around and get experience in different parts of the business, so that you have the context to be a good engineer. And I think if I look back on my own career, I think that the reason I've been as successful as I have is because I get into other people's business a little bit. I like understanding other parts of the business, other business units, other pieces of software, other services, so that I get this big picture and can see how it all fits together.
For sure. I think there are some engineers that are great at having that horizontal view and kind of systems view of an entire sort of running complicated machine. And I think those are people who naturally gravitate towards SRE and then kind of building up that capability in those roles. But I don't think that that's a scalable solution, because I don't think we actually have the ability to produce enough people like that with that kind of institutional level of knowledge. And so we need systems to help us bridge from, the world of, call it paper-based and in-memory up to, scaling to tens and then hundreds of microservices. And I mean, it's that sort of pain point, sort of tracking all of the info about apps and their services and their dependencies and their ownership and their versions that I think is this big problem lurking below the surface. And a little bit of a plug, but that's the exact pain point we saw last year, and we ended up leading a seed investment in a company called Ops Level, started by 2 former PagerDuty engineers around this exact topic of being able to build a service registry and repository for service ownership at maybe not day zero, since most people aren't willing to make that investment, but they're willing to make it at day one or day two.
Yeah, it's interesting is, first of all, you just explained why we can't hire more Jonathans. But number two, the big thing, I think we're kind of dancing around a little bit is really this concept of, SRE versus what I call the Amazon model, right? So if you look at Amazon's model, it's very two pizza box team. It's all very heavily service ownered. You have loose contracts between services, and you're thinking more about SDKs for integrations. And then you go to the Google model, and you got a much more, everyone is very consistent. Everyone is very structured in how we go. When they do an acquisition, the first year, the company goes dark as they go and re-engineer their entire application to be the Google way. And then that allows them to have this kind of very centralized SRE team that can at least take these services on and kind of go through the service SRE lifecycle as they want to go through that process. So it's interesting, and those are two very different ways of approaching the world. And from your perspective, you sound like you're describing very much the Google kind of model, and that seems to make sense for the Facebooks of the world. But you're also saying the Amazon model makes sense for the smaller companies too, which is what I'm hearing here. And so, Kai, what's your take on that?
I would say that both models work and can scale, but that increasingly, and especially today in 2021, the idea of having a centralized team at scale, that has kind of service ownership, service control, seems way more challenging to get consistent results and kind of high performance from than call it the Amazon model, where more of that is pushed to the edge, right? And I think it's important to think about when Google started SRE, and they really deserve the credit for blending together software developers and operations people in the early 2000s. That was a very different era. The number of developers, the number of services, everything. Right? It was 22 years ago, plus or minus a year or two, when they started that model. And so I think that for businesses, maybe let me phrase it this way, which is, I think for businesses for whom they are digital natives, tech is core to their business. Facebook, Netflix, Google, etc. And those are just big names, but it could be a smaller SaaS company as well. Salesforce, a little bit smaller, still not small. At that point, having application owners also own the infrastructure, the service nomenclature, service catalog, all of that, and essentially the Amazon two pizza model, like let's distribute this knowledge and this control to the edge, I think makes a ton of sense. On the other hand, if you're not a digitally native business, you're a manufacturer or a retailer or something like that, and technology or digital is part of your business, but it is not the main thing. At that point, I think maybe the idea of central teams makes more sense because you have sort of different things going on in your business rather than it being the main thing. What do you think?
I sort of agree with you. I think it's really a question of this digital native transformation and the cloud transformation really at the end of the day for a lot of these companies. There's also people who would argue very heavily that if you're in manufacturing and you're not trying to become a cloud native, that you're also missing the boat.
Very true.
So there's
but it's hard. It's hard to manufacture atoms out of bits, right? Like that's a hard transformation to make. People spent a lot of years in trying to make it work in physics, and we're not quite there yet.
It's definitely been interesting to see kind of the paradigm shifts that have happened. And you talked a little bit about monolithic to microservices, and you also mentioned service mesh, and so kind of get my soapbox a little bit. There's a lot of complexity there. There's a lot of complexity in infrastructure on top of Kubernetes, on top of microservices, on top of service mesh, service catalog, and being able to do automatic configuration management. And it works, but it does take a larger team of service owners to do that and to make sure that my configuration as a service works well, my logging as a service works well, and it in some ways, it puts a lot of pressure on the dev team to meet these standards and get in the way of developing. But it also, it means that you can't get those people who know how to fix these problems. And there is a point where I feel like a lot of solutions I see today are very heavily driven by these new technologies and the desire to build my resume with really cool things like Kafka and Kubernetes, versus actually just getting the solution that's going to work and meet the business need and solve the business challenge. And so I sometimes worry about that complexity and how that complexity is impacting the business, and the unaware cost that most CTOs and CFOs are taking when they say, oh yeah, we're gonna go to Kubernetes, when all I really need to do is be able to move widget A to widget B.
Totally agree with you. I mean, I think that there's a lot of, we have been in a decade-long transition of the disaggregation of the tech stack, and in some senses we're moving back towards aggregating or centralizing the tech stack once again. Whether you could say that the cloud providers are doing that, like Amazon, Google, Azure in the U.S. at least, and then providing higher and higher level services themselves. So, I can now get functions as a service and data storage as a service and processing as a service. And then I, as an engineer, don't need to necessarily build those things and choose Kafka for queuing or some other sort of management tool or framework, but I could just subscribe to them. But then that brings with it a whole other set of trade-offs in terms of vendor lock-in and skills needed, to your point. But it also reduces the choice, right? Of, okay, I don't have the paradox of choice if I can use any piece of open source software and any module, and then I hire Sarah and she's a Kubernetes person, and then after Sarah I hire Kevin and he's not a Kubernetes person, and now I have to arbitrate between these two humans about how they are manipulating, the bits and the software and the code. So no doubt it can get very dirty very quickly and kind of spiral out of control. I mean, I think that a lot of CTOs and in some cases CIOs or heads of engineering, maybe more relevantly here, are faced with the sort of ever-present tension of new people, when they come into an organization, want to bring their stamp on things, whether that's a new programming language or a new piece of tech stack, and balancing that with kind of keeping the machine running and humming and getting more efficient, not less efficient, as we add, as we bring more people in. And in some respects, I think that's one, it's a small factor, but I think it's one of the small factors that's given the no-code, low-code frameworks, like Heroku from a long time ago, but there's a lot of much more recent examples here that move out of PaaS to actually like giving business users development capabilities so that they don't need to talk to IT or even scope an engineering project. They can click and put things together like Lego bricks using Tray.io or something like that for their needs. And ultimately that those might turn into full-fledged applications that run on these hosted platforms and environments, and you don't need Kubernetes and service queues and memory management and databases and storage and more. But they're run by higher level services.
You mentioned vendor lock-in, which we love to talk about here at the show all the time. What's your? I think I guess what your take is, but how do you feel about vendor lock-in in this particular case? It's a cloud provider or Heroku you just mentioned. Those are big commitments, typically for engineering organizations.
I think vendor lock-in is an interesting thing, where I was taught early on in my career that you always have two vendors as a solution for the same thing, so that you can play them off each other or balance them out or switch one back and forth. And there's definitely, I think, moments in time, almost anytime there's a new piece of technology or a new approach. Think about when I started working, it was ATM and frame relay, and then the support for IP networking was different between Cisco and Bay Networks and different routing vendors. When Meraki, in 2012 was sort of a budding Wi-Fi company, Meraki versus Ruckus, they supported different protocols. Like they couldn't interoperate. At sort of a deep level, and they each had their edge. Those same unique features exist in the cloud, right? Amazon has a bevy of services from Lambda to S3 to other types of things, and now I think, and the same with Google and Azure. But I think now we have sort of vendor lock-in, partially from a brand perspective, and interfaces become de facto where new startups, new entrants are saying, use my thing, it's better, and here's the 8 reasons it's better. But oh, by the way, it's interface compatible with S3. Or I'm interface compatible with Mongo Atlas, because they're the de facto standard. And in many cases, it's because that can work, because those interfaces are part of the open source, either community in the or they're in the open source community because of like how Mongo grew up, and so therefore like they can't have corporate control over that interface and really enforce vendor lock-in. Another example of I think kind of how you can sort of work with vendors. We did this thing at Facebook called the Open Compute Project, which was really about designing data centers to be optimized for the servers within them, and the servers within them optimized for the applications. But that started when we were buying hundreds of millions of dollars of servers from Dell and HP and brands like that. And we said to them, hey guys, it's got to be better, cheaper, faster, right? What else is new? And Dell said, no, we can't do it. This is the least we could take. So we said, oh, well, let's redesign the server then. And Dell actually stood up a business. It's called DCS, Data Center Services. They stood up a business to redesign servers for people. And they did their thing, and we bought a lot of their product, and we worked collaboratively. But ultimately, there came a point where we're like, we want to go one step further. We want to do something that's different, that's cheaper, that's better for us. And it may not make sense for the rest of your business. And that meant taking on, we had to build a new engineering function. We had to build a supply chain function. Like we had to create all of these teams. What it meant for us as a business was we were able to build servers that were something like 30% more efficient on a power per watt basis and 20% more efficient on a cost per watt basis than anything else on the market. But that was for us, and until we open sourced it to the rest of the world. And then we shared our designs and our ideas, and other people made those ideas better and took them and made them their own. And so I think that, part of I think the biggest way to manage vendor lock-in is through open source and through open communities. But I've got one more anecdote to share about vendor lock-in, which is the unintentional vendor lock-in. There's a very large text-based chat system that we all use and love today that grew up in the age of AWS. And there came a point in time when AWS was working great for them, and they're great partners, but they needed presence somewhere else in the world that AWS didn't have presence with the right latency envelope. So they went to another cloud provider and stood up their service, and everything was going well until they started increasing load. And what they discovered, and I love this because we're talking about TCP today, is that the way GCP had configured the connection pools and connection buffers on their servers was different than how AWS had configured it. And so this company who was like, hey, we're totally vendor agnostic and independent, we could switch from AWS to anyone else, was unwittingly locked into AWS because their whole service was built on the premise of how many simultaneous connections can an AWS instance handle for our service.
That's a great story. It's one of those things you don't ever think about, and it does burn you. I actually, when people talk to me about lock-in, the one I say is, well, did you choose Java or did you choose .NET for your application stack? Like that's a form of lock-in too. And I don't think people realize that they're making these lock-in decisions almost every day.
Absolutely, yeah. If you choose an unpopular programming language, or you happen to stay on a programming language too long, let's say you're still using COBOL in your production infrastructure, it's pretty hard to hire developers who want to work on that code.
Yeah, for sure. And it also hurts you long term too if you end up on a legacy code base that you can't migrate out of quickly, or there's not a good alternative to. It can cause you a lot of pain and investment challenges in the future. It's interesting because I came from a networking background, way long time ago when I was doing hardcore infrastructure. I remember the first time I heard about Facebook and building their own load balancers. And I was like, why would they do that? It's so crazy. There's F5 and there's these other amazing solutions. And then you really start thinking about the scale of where Facebook had to be at that time to say, look, we don't need all these fancy features of F5. We need something that just load balances. And load balances the way that Facebook needs us to do it. And that's a whole different level of scale that most companies never really achieve. And I think a lot of companies want to come out and start up and say, hey, we're the next Facebook of X. And so we need to do all of that investment too. We need to have our own load balancer. And it's like, no. There was a point where I'm sure, Facebook was buying commodity load balancers. and there was a point where they said that's no longer going to work for them. You are not at that scale. And most startups make the mistake of thinking they're at a much larger scale than they are. And it's all tied typically to this lock-in fear. And that's the thing is like, not choosing serverless, not choosing a GCP service, not choosing these things because of that fear, or because, someday you're going to be massive is, I think, this huge crutch that kills us in the industry over and over again.
Yeah, I guess I agree and I disagree. The part I agree with there is don't make a simple problem complicated if you don't have to, for sure, right? Totally agree with that. Mm-hmm. I think when Facebook started, Mark, Dustin, and a few other engineers used the code and the kind of most popular open source projects that were available to them at the time, which was mostly PHP and MySQL as the backend, and it was that two-tier application structure got them to a couple of million users before they had also hired a phenomenal engineer, gentleman named Jeff Rothschild, who made a seminal decision for Facebook, which was to insert memcached, an in-memory cache layer between PHP and MySQL. And to be honest, that three-tier simple architecture stuck with the company until hundreds of millions of users, and what has now become hundreds of microservices and independent things that sit on the side of the main Facebook app. And so the reason that I disagree, I guess that's never mind. That's part of me agreeing that keeping things simple rather than making them complicated is better. Today Facebook is very different, of course, and when we were a billion users, we were very different. I think the important tenet that got set early in the company culture, just to talk about people again for a second, is we made the decision very early on, it was actually Jeff's decision, that we should never have commercial software between ourselves and our users. And his logic was simple and sound. Once again, simple is best. His logic was simply, if I have to depend on a vendor to fix a bug in the middle of the night, I have to call them, I have to influence them, I have to yell at them, I can stand on my head, all of those types of things. But at the end of the day, the vendor is making a decision to prioritize me against all of their other customers. Whereas if I have the code, it's in my repository, I control it, and I have the expertise, my people have 100% incentive and alignment to fix the bug, fix the problem, and make it right away.
I like that ideal. That's a great ideal. That's something which I think people tend to avoid, especially in older enterprises, because they want somebody else to be on the hook if there's a problem. And so we only buy Cisco, we only buy enterprise software from this company or this company because there's somebody to call if there's a problem. It's an interesting disparity between what really is best for you and your customers and the choices that people make. It's kind of strange.
I agree with you, Jonathan, and I think that it worked. It worked because Facebook was a digitally native company, and of the people and the caliber of people we were able to hire in the early days of the company. I think that would be really tough to take let's pick a business that's just not digitally native. If McDonald's is reinventing their entire IT systems, that run that Fortune 50 company, and they said we're not going to have any commercial software in between us and our customers, I think that'd be really hard for them to do, especially because they're already operating at an incredible scale, versus a startup who's starting today can make that decision. But when you make a decision like that, and if you sort of codify that in stone, then you're choosing to live by that for the rest of your existence, and unless you want to break the tablets and change things again. But just as Justin was talking earlier about load balancers and building our own, we were definitely at a certain scale to do that. But we had commercial load balancers in between us and users, and for a while that worked, and it worked until we wanted specific things out of our edge that other people didn't. And we weren't the first people to do that. Google had built their own edge, Microsoft had built their own edge, Amazon, Netflix, etc. And then that becomes an engineering trade-off of, do we put engineering dollars behind infrastructure that could make the site faster, more reliable, and ultimately support different kinds of product features in the future, maybe streaming, maybe advertising, or do we take those engineering resources and put them directly into product features now?
So I often hear people talk about how businesses should focus on, their core competencies. If your business is, selling loans, for example, then you should put your resources into the very specific business logic of selling loans and not invest in things like building your own load balancers or running your own services. And I think this has been the beauty of the public cloud and the growth of managed services is that all of a sudden dev teams can be experts in what they need to for the core business, but they don't need to be experts in MySQL or Redis or pick any managed service of 200 that Amazon or GCP or Azure have to offer now.
Absolutely, and I think that by and large that makes engineering teams more productive. They can build more features, they can build more business value, rather than doing the things that might be like cleaning out the pipes, so to speak.
Infrastructure as code has been part of what I've been sort of teaching for 5 or 6 years at least, and so eventually I think I'd like to almost see the word infrastructure team go away in businesses. I don't think it has a place anymore, especially for companies who can use a public cloud. I think we start thinking about these managed components as really just part of the application stack, and I don't think we will need dedicated infrastructure people at that point.
I could see that vision in the future, kind of like I can see crypto kitties flying around in the future. But I mean, I just pulled up aws.amazon.com. Right, there's hundreds of services. There's a market, and there's hundreds of products that Amazon provides, and then there's a marketplace on top of that for third-party services. And Cloudflare has a very similar marketplace and a very similar model. Many of these services are managed and they're available to people, but many of them are also just very basic. I'm not trashing them; they're just basic. And a business may come along, hey, I'm going from being a retailer to being online, and I love the Amazon Lex feature. It's voice and text chatbots, cool, but it doesn't do all the things I want. Oh well, I want to integrate this third-party tool. Maybe I use Customer for my voice and voice and text chatbots. Well, that takes an infrastructure engineer to stitch those things together and actually make them work and scale. Would be my hypothesis. So I guess you could say I'm not a fan of no ops, at least not yet.
Yeah, not either.
Not yet. We're not quite there yet. How do you feel about speaking about cloud and cloud services? How do you feel about what AWS especially has been seen to do in terms of taking Elasticsearch and MongoDB and other open source technologies and monetizing them in the way they have?
Honestly, I've only followed those conversations from a distance. My read on it is that AWS is and other clouds, they're doing the natural things that make sense for them and their customers, which is to offer higher and higher level services that better meet the needs of their customers. And the fact that they're able to take open source and use that as a starting point and stand on the shoulders of everyone else is an advantage that accrues to them and not to Mongo and Elastic and folks like that, because they may be the prognosticators, but that's no different than how that's no different than how Confluent started, where the team at LinkedIn created Kafka, open sourced it, and then some of the people on that team were responsible for founding Confluent, a commercial business, based on technology that was created at LinkedIn by someone else or by themselves, but under a different era.
As a sort of representative of VC, would you advise a startup? The open source startup model was viable anymore? I mean, it seems like there's been some huge backward steps in terms of licensing changes and things. Do you think is it possible to be successful using the open source or sort of freemium model, or do you think it's something that people should avoid anymore?
Well, I would separate the two, because I think open source is different than freemium. Open source is a one-way door, right? Once you put something out in open source, and I think it depends a little bit on the specific license model that's chosen, you generally can't take it back. Whereas freemium, Dropbox has a freemium offering. I can give my service away for free, and I can change what elements exist in that free tier versus the paid tier at any point in time, right? And that's sort of my decision as a company. I think one of the best things about open source is that you can get other people's ideas and input to your code, to the architecture, et cetera. And you can truly get engineering leverage from having more eyeballs, more contributors, et cetera. But in terms of business models, it's definitely made it trickier for businesses that are based around open source or open core. And I mean, I think one that is worth studying that's becoming a juggernaut in the industry is Hashicorp, because they have 7, 8 different open source projects that all kind of relate to each other. And they built a phenomenal commercial business around those open source projects without devaluing the open source projects by their very nature.
I actually reached out to them to ask them what their plans for the future were, given the steps that Elastic had made, and they're committed to their Mozilla license, and they say they have no intention of going back on that, which is awesome.
Yep. I'm just looking at their website now. So yeah, they have, I guess, 8 different applications, and they have now announced the Hashicorp cloud platform. That's what I wanted to see if it was public, because I lost track of it. I'd known about it for some time. And the idea being here that it's not just about running Hashi's services on the public cloud, but Hashi actually running their services, running Console, running Terraform, running Vault on behalf of their customers, because their customers don't want to manage the infrastructure, and so they want to consume these best-of-breed tools in a service-like function without needing the expertise behind them.
Yeah, I think the key thing is Amazon and these partnerships, with these companies to become more integrated. So I think it's yes, you can. It's great that you have this cloud service, but now I have a third-party processor I have to declare on my GDPR. I've got risks of you having my data that maybe I don't necessarily want to have out there. And so it's really, for my mind, it's how does Amazon and Google and Azure really partner better with these companies to offer their cloud services, but in a native way that gives me the confidence and protection of the hyperscaler at the end of the day. And I think I do wish Amazon was doing a slightly better job on the partner side. They're starting to seem to hear the message from the market that, yes, we want this, but that doesn't mean we want you to run it. And they're doing some more partnerships with like Prometheus and Grafana and some of the others. But, it's definitely, I think it's an interesting transition here over the next few years. I think we're still early days of some of this angst that I would say exists in the cloud space right now around this topic.
I think that's part and parcel for I think I called it concentration, but I really meant bundling and unbundling of technology services over the last 10 years.
Well, you mentioned a couple of your fantastic portfolio companies, including LaunchDarkly as well as OpsLevel. Any others that you would recommend some of our cloud listeners take a look at and think about for their solutions before we wrap up here?
Wow, if you're going to give me that kind of free time to just wax poetic about dev tools, then for sure. Well, I mean, I also.
Well, maybe pick your top 2. I can't give you all, but there's no favorites, right? In the VC
I can't promote all of them. Dang it. Well, yeah, so I talked a little bit about LaunchDarkly. It's feature management and allows companies to ship software with more confidence, simply because you can ship code without turning it on and control who gets it, when they get it, et cetera. I think that it's a company that's doing well. LaunchDarkly is doing very well, and as a result of many businesses deciding to shift their development processes and styles over to this method of coding, if you will. Talked a little bit about OpsLevel, service catalogs and service ownership, especially important in microservices environments. Maybe a third company to mention is more directly dev related is Gitpod, where we're investors with General Catalyst. Gitpod is really allows developers to quickly and easily spin up new dev environments and to automate that process. That could be on a task by task basis or on a project by project basis. And really start with sort of fresh builds every time, and not have to sort of fight for resources and things like that. But we also talked about Hashicorp, which is not an investment of ours; it's just a business we admire greatly. Businesses like Grafana that you mentioned, GitLab, and others, I think, are doing some tremendous things to make development easier and more accessible to people.
Well, we appreciate you coming and sharing your insights, and it's been fantastic. Jonathan, anything you want to add before we wrap up?
No, that's it. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Look forward to having you on maybe again in the future, maybe on the main show, and talk about some Google Cloud announcements or some other announcements in the space.
Sounds fun. I heard clouds in space. That sounds amazing.
Yep.
Right? Yeah, I mean, that is one of the things that Amazon and Azure seem to be in a race to do. So it's coming. Clouds in space soon. Well, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.